It wasn't Michael. The shape was broader, posture straighter, someone who moved with quiet certainty. A man stepped beneath the terrace light, raindrops sliding off a dark coat that somehow looked more expensive soaked than anything the Barringtons wore dry. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, voice low, controlled, with an accent Grace couldn't immediately place. Crisp, trained, yet warm at the edges. "Are you Grace?" She blinked, startled. "Ah, yes." He bowed his head once. Not exaggerated, just respectful, as if she were someone worth addressing. "My name is Adrian Hale." The name sparked recognition. Not because she knew him, but because everyone in the city did. The billionaire benefactor who opened schools, rebuilt neighborhoods. And the whisper that followed every article. His personal bodyguard, a man trusted with secrets of royalty and power. Grace swallowed. "What are you doing here?" Adrian's gaze flicked toward the glowing windows behind her. "I'm here on behalf of someone who values you greatly." Grace let out a small, humorless laugh. "You might be looking for the wrong person." But Adrian didn't waver. "I assure you, I'm not." Before she could speak again, thunder rumbled gently across the hills. The wind pulled at the edges of her dress. And for the first time that night, the air felt like freedom. Adrian removed his coat, a heavy, tailored piece, and draped it carefully around her shoulders. Heat and weight enveloped her like a shield. "It's cold," he said simply. No mockery, no judgment, no hesitation. Kindness, pure, unpolished, real, collided against the bruise her in-laws had been pressing all night. Grace felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. No one had offered her warmth in that house. If you were standing beside her right now, what would you have done in Adrian's place? Be honest. Write your answer below. And if words feel heavy tonight, just tap like to say, kindness still matters. Asterisk. Grace exhaled shakily. Why would someone like you care about someone like? He lifted a hand gently, not to silence her, but to slow her descent into old wounds. "Because someone important noticed your work," he said, "and because you've been underestimated for far too long." The words sank into her like light. Her work, not her husband's last name, not where she came from. Inside, Vivian's voice carried faintly through glass, sharp and dismissive. Adrian's attention narrowed. "You're not obligated to stand in rooms that belittle your existence, especially when you do more good in a week than some people do in a lifetime." Grace blinked up, stunned. You know what I do. I know you run code drives in winter. I know you personally deliver meals instead of just signing a list. I know children look for you on Saturdays because you sit on the floor and color with them. He paused. "And I know your husband hasn't shown up once." Her breath hitched. "Ow, there are eyes everywhere," he said gently. "Some watch to judge, some watch to protect, and some watch because your impact is quietly extraordinary." Grace looked away, blinking fast, the weight of his coat grounding her while her heart tried to rise like a startled bird. "No one's ever said that to me." Then you've been surrounded by the wrong audience. Rain pattered softly across stone tiles. A long silence stretched, comfortable this time, where Grace imagined a world where her efforts mattered, where her heart wasn't something to hide beneath dinner tables. She didn't notice the door open behind her until Michael's voice snapped across the terrace. "Grace, what are you doing out here?" He stepped forward, eyes flicking to Adrian. Irritation quickly masked behind practiced politeness. "And you are?" Adrian offered a small nod, unbothered. "Adrian Hale." Michael froze, recognition striking hard. Every Barrington headline had worshipped Adrian's employer, the billionaire prince with royal ties. To be close to that orbit meant power beyond money. Influence, reputation, news cameras. Michael's entire posture transformed. Shoulders back, smile bright, voice suddenly thick with charm. "Adrian Hale, I've heard so much about you. My family and I were just talking about the Royal Foundation." "I heard," Adrian replied, tone polite but cool. His eyes slid toward Grace. "And I heard the part about someone more suited." A flush crept up Michael's neck. "You took that wrong," he stammered. "Dinner conversations get twisted." "No," Adrian said carefully. "They reveal what's already true." For the first time since arriving, Grace wasn't the one shrinking. Michael finally noticed the coat around her shoulders. "You're wearing his jacket?" She was cold. Adrian answered before Grace could, and she deserved better warmth than she was given inside. Michael bristled. "You don't know us." Adrian's gaze hardened just enough to crack the air. "I know her worth is not measured at your table." Grace stood very still, adrenaline and awe mixing strangely. She felt like she was observing a moment she'd replay later and question if it really happened. Vivian appeared in the doorway next, eyes narrowing as she processed the scene. The coat, the man, the power shift she couldn't control. "Why are you here?" she demanded, tone clipped. Adrian turned fully toward her, rain softening his silhouette but amplifying his certainty. "Because Grace Barrington has been dismissed, mocked, and overlooked in her own marriage. And because the world beyond this estate knows her value, even if her own family does not." Silence slammed down like a dropped crystal goblet. Inside, candles trembled in their holders. A dozen expressions rippled across Vivian's face: irritation, disbelief, fear of being exposed. Grace watched it all, a strange electricity humming beneath her skin. For the first time in years, she wasn't standing alone, and Adrian hadn't even started telling them what he knew. Michael's jaw clenched as he stepped forward again, but the storm, the literal one and the quiet one building between them, refused to break just yet. Grace didn't know it, but this was the moment the ground beneath her life began to shift. Michael stepped closer, voice low enough to sound like control, but loud enough to sting. "You're making a scene, Grace." Grace felt her heart lurch, instinct urging her to shrink, apologize, retreat like she always did. But the weight of Adrian's coat steadied her spine. Something inside finally whispered, "No more." "I stepped outside to breathe," she said quietly. "That shouldn't be a crime." Vivian scoffed. "You dramatize everything. That is your problem." Adrian's jaw ticked once, but he didn't interrupt. He waited, letting Grace take her own ground. "Maybe," Grace said softly, surprised at the calm in her own voice. "My problem is that I keep pretending everything here is fine." That was when Harper emerged, wine glass in hand, curiosity sparkling like a child who sensed entertainment. "Mother, what's so?" Her eyes widened at Adrian. "Wait, you're him." Adrian inclined his head in acknowledgement. Harper turned to Grace with a smirk sharpened by envy. "You're talking to Adrian Hale in Michael's coat? Wow. Guess even unwanted things attract dust eventually." Grace flinched. Michael winced. Vivian didn't correct her. Adrian's expression didn't shift, but the air around him did, thickening, cooling. "Words like that," he said quietly, "are why most decent people would rather stand in the rain with strangers than sit at a table with family." Harper's cheeks reddened. "You don't know anything about us." "I know enough," Adrian replied, "and I know she deserves better." Grace swallowed, overwhelmed, unsure what to do with someone defending her so boldly. Michael snapped. "You're crossing a line." "No," Adrian said. "I'm drawing one." The wind pressed softly against the terrace curtains, like the storm itself wanted to listen. Grace stared at her hands, the ones that packed donations, mended toys, wrote lists for families the world pretended not to see. Hands that had shaken tonight, now slowly steadied in Adrian's borrowed warmth. She realized something. Maybe she'd been living so small she forgot she was allowed to take up space. Adrian turned to Grace with a gentler tone. "You don't have to stay here. We can leave." Michael sputtered. "Leave? With a stranger?" Adrian's voice lowered, barely above a whisper, but deadly clear. "I'm no stranger to the people she's helped." Grace blinked, confused yet stirred, an ache tugging her memory. "How could you know them?" "Because I was one of them once." Silence fell, thicker, different. Michael laughed harshly. "What, you? That's impossible." Adrian's gaze remained steady. "My mother cleaned houses for families who pretended she didn't exist. I watched her scrub floors for people who refused to say her name. A breath. I know invisibility. I know humiliation. And I know what it means to be judged by blood instead of heart." Grace's eyes widened, the edges of her world rearranging. This powerful, composed man, once unseen like her, his past slid into her like a mirror she didn't know she needed. Have you ever had someone step in for you when nobody else would? If that memory lives in your heart, write yes and share their name. Gratitude carries farther than you think. Vivian folded her arms. So you think pity gives you authority? Grace chose to marry into this family. She knew our expectations. Grace's breath caught, a truth she'd tried to forget. She had chosen Michael. She had chosen love, or what she thought love was before seeing its cost. Adrian stepped back slightly, respectfully giving her space to speak. Grace looked at Michael. Really looked, beyond the polished tie and practiced charm. She saw the man who once held her hands in small kitchens and whispered big dreams. But she also saw every moment he let his family's opinions become his compass. Saw every dinner where she sat silent because he never made room for her voice. Saw every promise he let fade quietly instead of fighting for. Tears stung her eyes, not from weakness, but clarity. Michael, she whispered, when did I stop being your partner and start being your liability? He froze, stunned, unprepared. What are you talking about? His voice shook, half defensive, half wounded. You stopped standing with me, she said, and I kept hoping you'd come back. A single raindrop plinked onto the terrace stone, bright under the lights like a tiny gem. Michael reached for her arm, reflex, desperation, but she stepped back before his fingers could touch. Inside, the dining room murmurs swelled, relatives peeking from curtains, whispers stirring like a rising wind. Grace realized she'd become the spectacle she feared, but for the first time, she did not shrink from it. Vivian snapped coldly. Enough of this nonsense. Grace, wipe your face, come inside, and behave. Every muscle in Grace's body tensed. Old conditioning, sit, smile, obey, clawed at her. But another truth rose louder. No. Vivian blinked. Excuse me? No. Grace repeated, voice trembling but unbreakable. I won't tuck my feelings under the table anymore. I won't pretend this family ever wanted me. Michael inhaled like someone punched him. Grace drew the coat tighter around herself, not hiding but claiming it. Adrian watched silently, his presence a quiet fortress behind her. The storm outside finally began to drift, the sky easing into something lighter, but Grace's storm was just beginning to turn into something else. And somewhere inside, a decision she never thought she'd make hovered on the edge of her tongue. Grace's pulse thudded in her ears, louder than the storm, louder than the murmuring relatives pressing against windows like spectators at a play. Michael stood frozen, torn between embarrassment and something like fear, not of losing her, but of losing control. You're being emotional, he said, trying for calm, landing on condescension. Grace let a sad, tired laugh slip out. Of course I'm emotional. That's what happens when you spend years swallowing every feeling to protect other people's comfort. Vivian opened her mouth, but Adrian stepped half a pace forward, silent as a shadow, his presence a warning. Let her speak. Grace faced her husband squarely. You promised me a home, not a gilded box I had to climb into alone. Michael's face pinched. You have a home. No, she whispered. I have a door they keep trying to shut in my face. Something in him flickered. Recognition, guilt, pride scuffling for dominance. But before words could form, the door behind Vivian burst wide, and family members spilled onto the terrace. Curiosity no longer containable behind velvet curtains. Aunts, cousins, business partners. All the people who had ignored her suddenly wanted the drama. One uncle muttered, "The help always gets rowdy," and everything in Grace went still. She stepped into the center of the terrace, rain-soft air wrapping around her like a second skin. I'm not the help, she said clearly. I am Grace. The name echoed, startlingly loud in a house that had only ever whispered it with disdain. And I'm done shrinking for people who celebrate cruelty. Faces shifted, whispers sharpened. Michael's hand shook. If you leave, they'll think. Grace cut him off gently. I don't care what they think anymore. Outside, a distant siren wailed, life moving on while she finally paused hers. Her chin lifted, eyes sweeping the circle of privilege that had never once looked back at her with humanity. You measure worth by money and lineage. I measure it by kindness and impact. And maybe that means I was never meant to belong here. Adrian nodded once. a soldier acknowledging a queen who hadn't yet realized her crown. The wind lifted the terrace drapes, revealing the city below, glittering, alive, waiting. And maybe, Grace added, tears slipping without shame, I don't need belonging from people who don't know how to offer it. A tremor passed through the crowd. Someone muttered, she's ungrateful. Another said, embarrassing. Grace's shoulders squared, not hard but steady. You have no idea what I've done, she said softly. While you laughed at charity work, I was brokering donations. While you ignored entire neighborhoods, I was listening. When a shelter nearly shut down, I sold half my wardrobe to keep the heat on. Gasps. Harper scoffed. Vivian's mouth pressed to a white line. Adrian's voice sliced gently through the tension. She saved 63 families from losing housing last winter. The foundation verified every receipt. 63. Grace hadn't counted. She'd just done what needed doing. For the first time, a few expressions faltered. Uncertainty, maybe shame. Now it's your turn. Share one good thing you've done lately, no matter how small. Leave it in the comments so the world remembers goodness still walks among us. Your tiny ripple might be someone else's lifeline tonight. Grace's breath caught, the moment stretching fragile and powerful. Michael stepped forward, voice cracking. Why didn't you tell me? Grace met his eyes, really met them, and said the truth she had never dared speak. Because every time I tried, you told me it wasn't important. Michael staggered back as if she'd struck him, not with force, but with honesty. Vivian trembled with fury. You should apologize. This family. Grace shook her head slowly. No. Tonight, I stop apologizing for not being what you wanted. The storm clouds overhead opened just enough for moonlight to spill onto the terrace, silver and clean. Adrian extended a hand. Not demanding, not leading, simply offering. Grace, he said quietly, you choose the next step. She stared at the threshold, mansion behind her, city before her, and realized for the first time in her marriage, she wasn't afraid of taking a step alone. Her fingers fluttered toward Adrian's palm, then paused midair, trembling with the weight of a decision that might break her old life open. And somewhere inside, a truth she hadn't yet spoken gathered breath, ready to change everything. Grace's fingers hovered over Adrian's outstretched hand, trembling in the charged quiet. Every breath felt like a crossroads. But she didn't take his hand. Not yet. Instead, she drew it back to her heart, palm pressed flat, anchoring something fierce inside her. I need to know who I am, she whispered, before I let anyone guide me anywhere. Adrian's eyes softened with something like respect, approval, even. He retracted his hand, not wounded, not impatient, simply present. The crowd behind them murmur-stirred again, disappointed the spectacle hadn't turned into a dramatic escape. Vivian let out a relieved, smug huff. Good, she snapped. Maybe you're finally thinking straight. Grace whirled. No, I'm thinking clearly for the first time in years. Vivian flinched, surprise breaking through her lacquered composure. Grace stepped forward, the motion unplanned but unstoppable. And I'm not leaving with him because I don't need rescuing. Her voice carried, soft but thunder true. Michael's shoulders sagged in momentary relief, but it evaporated when Grace turned to him next. And I'm not staying here either. The terrace seemed to inhale sharply. Michael blinked, stunned. What? I'm leaving, Grace said, every word slow, deliberate earned. Not because I want someone else, but because I will no longer stay somewhere I'm unwelcome. A stunned silence, then Harper's incredulous laugh. You have nowhere to go. Grace exhaled a shaky breath. There are 1,000 places kinder than this house. Vivian scoffed. Like where? Street corners? Shelters? Grace's expression didn't waver. Yes, she said, because I've seen more genuine love in a shelter hallway than in every room of this mansion. A rumble of discomfort spread across the watching crowd. Some guilty, some enraged, some suddenly unsure of their own reflections. Michael stepped toward her again, hands open. Grace, wait. We can fix. No, she said gently. You need to fix you. And I need to remember who I was before I lost myself trying to earn a chair at your table. Her words shook, not from fear, from release. Then the moonlight caught something in Adrian's face, a flicker of conflict he'd been holding back. He inhaled, steeling himself, as if about to cross his own invisible line. "There's something you should know," he said quietly. Grace turned. The room leaned in. Adrian hesitated, not from doubt but reverence. "This wasn't coincidence," he said. "I didn't just show up tonight." Grace's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" Adrian drew a steady breath. "I was sent." Michael bristled. "By who?" "By the prince," Adrian replied simply. A collective gasp. Even the candles inside trembled. Grace blinked hard. "The prince? Why would he care who I am?" Adrian's voice lowered, heavy with truth. "Because you saved his daughter." Time froze. Grace felt the air shift around her. Unreal, impossible, yet tugging something deep in memory. "The little girl," Adrian continued gently. "2 winters ago, you found her crying alone behind the shelter dumpster. You wrapped her in your own coat, took her inside, fed her soup, read to her until she slept." Grace's hand flew to her mouth. "That was just a child who got turned around in the snow. She was lost," Adrian whispered, "and she had wandered from her nanny. The prince never released her identity, for safety. But he never forgot the woman who stayed with his daughter for hours and refused a reward because, quote, it's what any human should do." Grace staggered. I didn't know." Adrian nodded. "You never asked. That's why he trusts you more than all the people chasing his money." Michael swayed like someone hit in the chest. Vivian's complexion paled to porcelain. Harper looked ready to faint. "And tonight," Adrian finished, pain threading his tone, "I came because he heard that you were struggling. He wanted you to know your heart has never gone unseen." Grace tried to speak. Sound failed her. Her knees nearly buckled, but Adrian shifted subtly, close enough to catch her if she fell, far enough not to smother her sovereignty. "If that revelation shook something inside you, leave a red heart. Sometimes a single symbol says what 1,000 words can't." Grace's eyes filled, this time with something lighter, brighter, terrifyingly vast. "I thought I didn't matter," she whispered. "You mattered enough," Adrian said, "to change the course of one royal family's life." Silence swallowed the terrace, thick, reverent, universe shifting. Michael whispered raw, "Grace, why didn't you tell me?" Grace met his eyes, tenderness and tragedy tangled together. "Because I didn't do it to be seen. I did it because a child needed help." Michael's face crumpled. Not anger now, but a grief realizing its own failure. Vivian opened her mouth. No insult formed. For the first time, Grace wasn't small or quiet or apologizing. She stood in the same soaked heels and borrowed dress, but somehow taller, crowned with something invisible but unmistakable. Power. Not given, earned. Not loud, undeniable. And just as her next words formed, the mansion lights flickered. A ripple from the storm. Or maybe the universe shifting, making room for who Grace was finally ready to become. The chandeliers inside flickered again, a stutter of gold and shadow washing across the terrace. It made the family's painted certainty waver, like their world was suddenly built on thinner ground. Grace stood motionless, Adrian at her side like a silent promise, Michael trembling at the edge of his own unraveling. "You helped the princess," Harper whispered, voice faint, swallowed by the wind. The sneer she always wore slipped away. It wasn't replaced by kindness, just the stark awareness that she had misjudged everything. Vivian stepped forward, stiff, brittle, clutching dignity like pearls about to snap. "All of this," she sputtered, "doesn't change anything. A single good deed doesn't make you." Grace finally looked at her mother-in-law, really looked. The woman who had been an immovable wall her entire marriage suddenly seemed small. Tired. Fighting battles Grace had never been invited to understand. "It's not a single deed," Grace said quietly. "It's how we show up for people, especially when no one is looking." Vivian's facade trembled, her lips pursing as if years of superiority suddenly tasted sour. Michael took another step. "Grace, please," he said, voice raw. "Come back inside. We'll talk. I'll listen this time. I swear I will." Grace saw it. Not the old dismissiveness, but something messy underneath. Regret, fear, the dawning realization that he hadn't just ignored her. He'd taken her entirely for granted. And she felt something unexpected, grief for what could have been. "Michael," she whispered, "I loved you. I really did." He inhaled sharply, like that admission pierced him deeper than any accusation. "And I wanted your family to love me too," she continued, tears welling but her voice steady. "I tried so hard. I reshaped myself until I barely recognized the woman in the mirror." Michael's face crumpled. "You never had to." "Yes," she said gently, "I did. Because every room I entered here told me I wasn't enough." The terrace fell utterly silent. The truth hurt, but it didn't destroy her. It set her free. Vivian stiffened defensively. "We simply have standards." "No," Grace replied softly. "You had fear. Fear of someone different. Someone who didn't come from your world. And maybe I was afraid too. Afraid I wasn't worthy of the life you all took for granted." A hush settled. Even the rain seemed to pause. Michael reached for her hand, hesitant, shaking, but Grace didn't move to meet it. "Grace, I'm sorry," he whispered. "I let them shape how I saw you. And I shouldn't have." Grace's throat tightened. There it was, the apology she had prayed for in the dark nights when she wondered if she mattered at all. Adrian stayed still, a respectful shadow, letting the story unfold without claiming space meant for Grace alone. For a moment, Grace saw possibility, not of returning, but of closure. She touched Michael's fingers lightly, not holding, just acknowledging. "I forgive you," she breathed. Michael's eyes flooded. Shock, relief, heartbreak tangled together. But then she let his hand fall away. "Forgiving you," she said gently, "doesn't mean I can stay." Michael's breath faltered. "Please, you need to grow without me holding your hand," she said softly. "And I need to grow without begging to be welcomed. Be honest, could you forgive after what they did? Type forgive if your heart could, or never if the pain would be too deep. There's no wrong answer, only truth." Vivian turned away, shoulders stiff, but Grace caught something startling in her posture. Not rage, but wounded pride unraveling into uncertainty. Harper swallowed, her expression hollowed out. The gleeful predator replaced by someone who finally saw the wound behind Grace's composure. Adrian was the only one who didn't look shattered by the moment. He saw strength where everyone else saw loss. Grace turned toward the city lights shimmering beyond the iron railings. Distant windows full of unknown faces and unfamiliar laughter. Once, that distance would have terrified her. Tonight, it felt like horizon. "I'm going to the shelter," she said quietly. "I want to be with people who see me, and people I can help." "I'll drive you," Adrian offered. Grace nodded, grateful, not dependent. Michael choked out one last plea. "Will I ever see you again?" Grace hesitated, not from uncertainty, but from tenderness. "You might," she said softly. "But when you do, I hope you'll be someone who stands beside me. Not in front, not behind." Michael bent his head, the first humble gesture she'd ever seen him make. Grace turned, her heels clicking softly on wet stone, and as she passed the threshold of the terrace, something in her chest unlocked. Not escape, becoming. And as she walked toward the storm-soft driveway, knowing she would not return tonight, every step stitched a new heartbeat into her life, one she finally owned. Rain slicked the driveway like black glass, reflecting streaks of yellow from the estate's tall windows. Grace walked slowly at first, each step a goodbye. She didn't need to speak out loud. Adrian matched her pace, a respectful half-step behind, present, but not pushing. The great oak doors shut behind them with a soft, resonant thud. Not a slam, not a command, just an ending. She paused at the bottom of the steps, letting the moment land. Her borrowed dress clung to her, Adrian's coat heavy and warm around her shoulders. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Grace didn't answer immediately. She was thinking, actually feeling, the shock of what she'd done. "I don't know," she finally said, a breath trembling into the cold air. "But I'm free." Adrian nodded, the smallest smile tugging at his normally disciplined expression. Freedom rarely feels comfortable at first. They continued toward the car, a sleek black vehicle that looked like it belonged to a different world than the one she'd just walked out of. But before they reached it, something made Grace stop. She turned around. The mansion loomed behind her, all marble and glass and invisible chains. Through one window, she saw silhouettes. Michael motionless, Vivian stiff as carved stone, Harper wiping her eyes or maybe smearing mascara into war paint. Grace didn't hate them. Shockingly, she didn't even resent them. She simply saw them. A family trapped in its own expectations. Prisoners of pedigree. Afraid to live small, unable to imagine living wide. For the first time, Grace didn't want their validation. She wanted something far bigger. I spent so long wanting them to like me, she murmured. I never asked if I liked myself. Adrian studied her quietly. And do you? Grace looked down at her hands, scarred from boxes and blankets, ink stained from donation forms, tiny crescent nail marks from holding back tears. I think I'm getting to know her, she said softly. She's stronger than I thought. A slow exhale left Adrian's chest. Not dramatic, but meaningful. You're more than strong, he said. You're necessary. The rain softened in a mist, like the sky was exhaling too. Grace stepped forward again, and this time her stride was sure. Less like retreat, more like pilgrimage. When she reached the car, Adrian held the door open. Grace hesitated. Not because she doubted leaving, but because she felt something shift inside herself. A pivot toward a version of her life she'd never let herself imagine. She slid into the seat, and when Adrian closed the door, she felt the world seal behind her, the past on one side of the glass, the future waiting outside the windshield. The car eased down the winding drive, gravel crunching beneath tires. Grace watched the mansion shrink through the rear window, its lights dimming behind the curve of trees. She didn't feel hollow. She felt open. Adrian drove without music, letting silence be a companion instead of a burden. After several minutes, Grace spoke, her voice low but certain. I'm not broken. No, Adrian said. You're just beginning. She let the words rest. Let them sink into wounds that have been held shut too long. City lights bloomed ahead, street lamps glistening on wet pavement, neon signs winking from diners and corner stores. Unlike the mansion's brutal glow, this light felt alive. Do you ever think, Grace said, staring out the window, that people end up exactly where they need to be? Adrian considered that. I think we end up where we're meant to grow. Grace nodded, the answer fitting more softly into her chest than certainty ever had. She thought of the shelter, the chaos, the noise, the mismatched furniture, the laughter that came too loud or too late. A place where no one cared who your parents were, only whether you were hungry or hurting. She belonged there, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Ahead, the city opened like a book she hadn't finished writing. If you believe love and kindness still win, even after the hardest nights, type amen in the comments. Let this space be a spark of hope for someone scrolling through their own storm. Grace rested her forehead briefly against the cool glass. Tired, relieved, hopeful, cautiously at first, then fiercely. Because somewhere out there, people needed her. And maybe, just maybe, she needed them too. Adrian glanced at her from the driver's seat. Not possessively, not protectively, but impressed, as if witnessing a star learn it didn't need a sky to shine. You know, he said eventually, voice almost playful, the prince has been hoping to meet you again. Grace blinked. Me? But Adrian shook his head. No qualifiers. No apologies. Just Grace. She let a tiny smile escape. It felt like the first real smile she'd worn in months. The car turned onto a street she knew well, lined with murals and mismatched planters and people bundled against the cold. Home was ahead. Not the one with chandeliers, but the one with mismatched mugs and laughter that warmed from the inside out. Grace straightened her shoulders. Let's go. And as the shelter's familiar brick shape appeared through the mist, something inside her sparked bright. A fuse she'd never realized was waiting for ignition. The shelter appeared through the thinning rain, a squat brick building with peeling paint and a buzzing porch light that never quite decided whether to stay lit. To most people in the Barrington circle, it would have looked unimpressive, maybe even beneath notice. To Grace, it looked like sanctuary. Adrian parked at the curb. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Grace stared at the chipped steps, the hand-painted welcome sign that leaned a little too far to the right, the fogged windows glowing with soft yellow light from the common room. Through the glass, she could see silhouettes, people talking, laughing, someone bouncing a toddler on their knee. Real life. Messy. Loud. True. This is where you go to breathe, Adrian said quietly. Grace turned to him, surprised. You make it sound like you've been here before. Adrian's eyes flickered with a story he didn't tell. Not this exact place, he said. But I know the look of a doorway someone walks toward because their soul recognizes it. Grace's throat tightened. He wasn't just talking about shelter walls. She opened the car door. A gust of cool air swept in, smelling of rain and asphalt and street food drifting in from a block away. It felt like the city exhaling, as if glad she had returned to it. Grace stepped out, and before she could straighten fully, the shelter door flung open. Grace! A blur of motion darted down the steps. A small girl with braids and rain boots 2 sizes too big. Lily! Grace gasped, kneeling instinctively. The child collided with her, arms around her neck, face pressed into her shoulder. You're back! Lily cried. Ms. Karen said you wouldn't come tonight because rich people took you away. Grace laughed, the kind that burned through emotion and landed as sunlight. Not forever, she whispered. Just for dinner. Lily pulled back, studying her with solemn eyes too old for 7. You don't look happy from the dinner. Grace's heart twisted. Kids didn't need details. They sensed truth. I'm happier now, Grace said. Because I'm here. Behind the girl, more people spilled onto the porch. A teenage boy in a hoodie, a tired mom with a baby, Mr. Everett with a mustache that twitched whenever he tried not to cry. Grace! You're soaked. We saved you a plate. It's cold, but we can warm it. You all right? Do we need to beat somebody up? A laugh rippled through the group. Genuine, ragged, healing. Grace felt her lungs expand. Full for the first time that night. Adrian stayed near the car, giving her space, but the porch crowd eyed him curiously. Lily peered up at Grace. Who's that? Grace glanced over her shoulder. He's a friend, she said. Does he want soup? The girl asked simply. Adrian's brows lifted, surprised. No, thank you, he said with a small smile. But I appreciate the offer. Lily nodded, satisfied. Okay, if you get hungry, you can come inside. There's always room in the circle. Grace blinked hard. That was what belonging sounded like. She led Lily back toward the porch, Adrian following at a respectful distance. Inside, the shelter smelled like damp coats, tomato soup, crayons, and laundry soap, an odd mix that somehow warmed your bones. A handful of people looked up as Grace entered. Someone clapped. Someone else sniffled. Grace barely made it 3 steps before Mrs. Dela Cruz, tiny, fierce, the unofficial grandmother of the shelter, wrapped her in a hug that pinned her arms. My girl, the older woman murmured into her hair. You left for one night and the lobby felt empty. Grace swallowed a sob. How could a cramped shelter feel more like home than a mansion with 20 heated rooms? She pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. I missed you too. Mrs. Dela Cruz leaned in. And we missed your stories. No one reads as good as you. Grace laughed, wet and shaky. Well, then I better get back to work. From behind, Adrian finally stepped fully into the doorway. He didn't announce himself. He simply existed, quiet, observing, fitting awkwardly but respectfully into the space. A woman holding a baby nodded to him. You're the bodyguard guy, aren't you? Adrian blinked. Occasionally, her lips twitched into a half smile. Well, any friend of Grace is safe here. Safe. The word landed with finality. Grace turned to Adrian, gratitude spilling from her expression. You should stay a moment, she said softly. Come inside. Feel what it's like. Adrian hesitated, unsure if a royal guard belonged in a place with mismatched chairs and chipped plates. But Grace gently nudged his arm. You defended me tonight. Let us offer you something too. After a beat, he stepped inside. It felt like a small miracle. The billionaire world meeting the forgotten one without pretense or pity. If you believe people deserve a second chance, and that homes can be found in unexpected places. Write hope in the comments. Someone scrolling might need to see it tonight. Grace moved into the crowded room, welcomed like a missing puzzle piece snapping into place. And for the first time since she married, she felt whole. Not because she was needed, but because she belonged. Inside the shelter, warmth wrapped around Grace like a blanket fresh from the dryer. Not fancy warmth, but the kind woven by people who'd earned every bit of comfort through storms of their own. Lily tugged her hand. We were coloring pictures for the bulletin board. Come see. Grace smiled. Let me hang up my coat first. She slipped Adrian's jacket carefully over a chair, noticing how wildly out of place it looked among patched hoodies and fraying scarves. But somehow, it belonged anyway. Adrian stood near the entrance, shoulders slightly hunched, like a warrior out of armor who suddenly wasn't sure where to put his hands. Still, he watched Grace, not as someone he needed to guard, but someone he admired finding her ground. Lily dragged Grace toward a cluster of kids sitting cross-legged on the rubber mat floor. Paper, crayons, torn coloring books, a joyful mess. One boy held up a drawing proudly. It's a house with 1,000,000 windows. Everyone gets a room. Grace crouched beside him. I'd love to live there. You can, he said. You're invited. Grace's throat tightened again. Tonight was determined to wring every last tear from her. She sat, children pressing close, someone placing a crayon in her hand like a baton in a relay. She'd never stopped running. Across the room, Mrs. Delacruz was whispering to Adrian. Grace couldn't hear every word, just snippets carried by air. Been through worse than royalty. Protector's heart. Don't let her shrink again. Adrian nodded respectfully every time the older woman poked a finger in his direction. When she finished, she patted his cheek like a blessing. Adrian looked as though the gesture stunned him more than any diplomatic gunfire could have. Grace felt a quiet laugh bloom in her chest. A family, not bound by blood, but by survival, resilience, tenderness, had already folded her back into their story. As kids switched from coloring to arguing over crayons, Grace stood. Her eyes found Adrian's, and this time, she crossed to him. I owe you something, she said, hands clasped. Adrian shook his head. You owe no one, not even me. Grace held his gaze. For listening, she clarified. For showing up. For speaking when I couldn't. Adrian's expression softened, a crack in his disciplined composure revealing something warmer beneath. You did the hard part, he said. I just stood where you asked me to. Grace smiled, small, grateful, real. And tomorrow, she asked, will all of this still be true? Adrian took a slow breath, as if measuring the weight of the next moment. Yes, he said, because you didn't step out of a life tonight, you stepped into yours. A silence settled, comfortable, glowing. Then Mrs. Delacruz clapped her hands. Enough talking, you two. We have a water heater that sounds like a dragon and needs wrangling. Laughter rippled through the room. Grace moved toward the hallway without hesitation, muscle memory pulling her exactly where she was needed. Adrian followed, more as witness than companion. The heater roared and clanked like something possessed. Grace smacked it twice, then twisted the valve the way the maintenance guy taught her months ago. It shuddered, hissed, then settled into a cooperative hum. Magic disguised as practical skill. Adrian blinked. You wrestle dragons too? Grace grinned. Only temperamental ones. By the time she returned to the main room, the chaos had organized itself. Kids playing hangman, a teenager braiding a friend's hair, Mr. Everett folding donated blankets into uneven stacks. Grace stood in the doorway and watched. Watch her real life. Not perfect, not polished, but deeply hers. Adrian stepped to her side. What now? Grace exhaled softly. I stay. I help. I live. And Michael, he asked gently. Grace bowed her head for a moment. I hope he grows, she said. Not for me, for himself. A hush brushed the room, almost like a prayer. If this journey touched you, and if Grace's courage lit something inside, tap like not for me, but for her and every person who stayed kind while being wounded. One click is a whisper that says, I felt this too. Grace turned, scanning the faces inside the shelter. People who own nothing but stories and hearts too big to be held by their circumstances. Then she looked at Adrian, not as a savior or a symbol, but simply as someone who arrived at the exact right moment. "Tell the prince thank you," she said. "But he doesn't owe me anything." Adrian nodded. "You may find he disagrees." Grace laughed softly. "Then he can disagree from a distance. I like my life right where it is." Adrian smiled. The first full one she'd seen from him. Rare and sincere. "You're remarkable," he murmured. Grace shook her head. "No, I'm just not invisible anymore." The night deepened outside, but the shelter glowed brighter, the kind of light that didn't come from chandeliers or polished silver. It came from people. Grace lifted her chin, steady and sure. "Tomorrow," she said, "we start a coat drive again. It's getting cold." "And you'll succeed," Adrian replied. Grace nodded. "I already have." The storm had passed, outside and inside, leaving her standing exactly where she was meant to be. Not a guest, not an outsider, not someone waiting for permission, but a woman with her own story, written in courage, seasoned by pain, and gilded by kindness. A woman who finally knew her power. The end.